So our focus today is going to be to talk about authentication and some of the options which are available within OpenIAM. So we'll start out by just like we always do, kind of talk a little bit about the different options which are available within OpenIAM, and then how we can go ahead and configure these. Given that this topic's a little bit complex and it has a lot of options, what we'll probably do is after we complete our session today, the video that we post, we'll kind of re-record it with a lot more detail and break it up into two parts, kind of covering the different options which are available, right? So, and as always, if you have questions, go ahead and post, and I'll answer them as best as I can. Okay. So when we look at the capability for authentication within OpenIAM, and then this slide, I've broken this up into two parts, one which is available in the community version, and the other which is in the enterprise version. So in the community version, we have some basic capabilities, like we have user ID and password-based authentication, there's certificate-based auth. There's OTP available over SMS and email, and there's a very limited amount of adaptive auth that was introduced in that version. In the enterprise version, we have user ID and password. We have certificate, just like we do in the community. On the OTP side, we go a little bit further, where we have interactive voice as well. So for example, if you have Twilio, you can receive your OTP tokens over a phone call if you want to. There's also a mobile app. It's the OpenIAM Authenticator app, which does a push notification. So if you want to do like a passwordless authentication, you could configure that as well. FIDO2 is supported, so you can use something like a YubiKey key to be able to plug it in and do authentication that way. The adaptive authentication is built out a lot more, and then there is support for a third-party authenticator like Thales, which both their on-prem and cloud platforms are supported. On the adaptive auth, it's an area which is always evolving, and in the version that we release in the early summer, which is going to be 4.2.2, machine learning has been introduced into that version as well. So you can you'll be able to use AI then to be able to detect behavioral patterns and have authentication rules which are based on those patterns. So it gets a little bit more sophisticated than even what's here right now. So let's talk a little bit about some of the terms which we use. And it's kind of important to kind of understand these, because they can lead to confusion if we don't kind of resolve this up front. So the first thing that you hear about is an authentication policy. And the authentication policy is kind of a structure that's left over from the earliest parts of OpenIAM, the earliest, like version 1 and 2, where the authentication policy was limited to defining things like the field authentication counts and parameters like that, like session tokens. But it also has an important attribute in it, which is it lets you link the authentication to a source. So you can pick your managed system, for example. And with that, you can basically use any backend that you have as your authentication repository. So you can use the OpenIAM database as you want, which is the default. You could plug in your LDAP, your AD. If you wanted to use, say, your SAP source, you could. So you can really use anything that you have a connector for to authenticate users. Now, some might be more practical than others, but the option exists. The authentication provider kind of gives us a lot more flexibility, and we'll use this more even on the next session that we do on Thursday, where in this case, it's going to be a type of authentication provider that we call a authentication policy. And basically, this links the authentication policy, which defines the parameters together, but it also has things where you can say, well, if you're going to use OTP, what types of OTP do you want to use? If you want to use certificate-based authentication, some guidelines around that as well. So those are fine. Those are quick, easy ways to enable MFA into your application. And then once you define your authentication policy, you can link it to an authentication provider. You could link it to your content provider, right? The content provider is your domain, which is representing OpenIAM, and you can say, well, I have this, provider that I've configured. I'm going to link it to this content provider, and that means those authentication rules will be enforced on any URL that I want to use. Okay. Authentication rules go a lot further. They allow us to define more elaborate authentication workflows that take into various parameters, and so you can, construct you know, not just, like simple linear tasks like using OTP, but you can say, well, if my device is different, or if I use a certain role, then, follow a certain path, right? So you can do those kind of things. And you can then take those rules and link them at different levels. You can say, well, it can either be linked at the content provider, which is the whole domain, or you can say, well, I have a certain set of URLs which are more sensitive than others, and you can link them to that. So in effect, you're creating a step-up authentication functionality, right? So you could come in with, say, a password-based authentication, hit a certain URL, and the system says, nope, I need to know more about who you are. And at that point, it will force you to authenticate with those new rules. Okay. So let's start to configure this. So we have a few things to do. So let's start out with taking a look at the authentication policy, and then we'll look at the authentication providers. We'll then look at some things that you need to set up beforehand. And that is, if you're planning on using the email and the SMS-based capability, then obviously we need to set those up first before we can do anything else. The email we looked at earlier, but we'll take a look at it again just as a refresher. And then we'll move on to creating those authentication rules. Okay. So we're going to go back to our test instance like we had before. So in the web console, under policy, you'll see password policy, authentication rule. Let's go to authentication policy. And you'll see that there are two defined here by default. So let's just pick the first one. And you'll see that there really isn't that much here, right? So we have the auto unlock time. This means that if I've locked myself out, if I want to auto unlock, there's a time that goes with it. Linked to this is also a scheduled task, so that must be activated. The failed authentication count. So to lock the user after a certain number of failed authentication attempts. Some of these things, like for example, the URL, this could be where you want to redirect to if you failed the authentication. And the rest of this is not really that important for us anymore. But if we look at this one, manage system ID, this is pretty important in the sense that it tells us what we're going to be using as the backend to authenticate. By default, it's OpenID because this is the one repository that you're always guaranteed that the system's up is also available, because otherwise OpenID won't be up. Okay. And then the other part is your token life, which is, again, it's linked. This is your session. And your token is sure. This can be tied to your domain. So with this, by changing this, we can now use LDAP. We can use another source, and it opens up options in terms of how we can authenticate. So assume that you've done this. The next part then is we can go to an authentication provider. So let's go to access control, and let's click on authentication provider, and let's click create a new provider. You'll scroll down and you see various different authentication providers, and we'll touch on these next time. And we'll see a few here which are related to social authentication. Social authentication is supported as well. For some reason, I forgot to cover that. It's in the enterprise version and not in the community version. And you can pick authentication policy. The session that we do on Thursday when we talk about SSO, we'll cover using SAML and OAuth and OpenID Connect and how we can configure those. We'll also talk about how we can integrate with the OpenID API and we'll use Postman as a client for that. So let's create an authentication policy. And let's just say, we'll call this, my auth policy. Right. And again, here, if I want to, I can, if I I can override and I can define the policy that I want to use. So I can use my AD configuration. And in this case, this will go outside of the authentication policy. Here, I can link my default policy if I want to. And let's just see, and we're going to pick OpenIAM. Now, here's the part where I want to enable the TOTP. Sorry, if I want to enable OTP in general. So this is if I'm going to use the mobile app, and if I want to have TOTP being enabled. If I just want to use the OTP providers, here I can pick the options I want. So let's say I want to have text by Twilio. I also want to have the email option, and I also want the voice call. Right. So this means that when I log into my login page, I'm going to see 3 different options. Okay. I'm not going to activate this because I don't want to risk getting blown out during the demo. And here we can define how long that OTP period is going to be alive. So if we issue a token, we don't want that token to be alive for for a terribly long period. It can't be a permanent thing. The TOTP, this will have a much shorter life because you'll see it on your mobile app that it's changing every 30 seconds. Okay. There's also other factors here, like if you want to enable certificate-based auth, we can define this as well. So there's some basic authentication that we can do. We can turn this on and we can say, okay, this is defined. We have some simple MFA turned on. And now I want to determine which content provider I link it to, right? And remember, we can have more than one content provider. So let's say, for example, we have, let's say we have one content provider for admins to use, and we have another one for our normal end users. If we want to, we could take this authentication policy that we create, and let's just save this. And I didn't set the password policy. Okay, I checked off things I shouldn't have checked. Okay, and here at this point, I can go in to the authentication provider, to the content providers, and I can just associate this right here with I can just change it to my authentication policy, right? And this will now enable TOTP for, whenever I'm going to access this particular domain, right? Which is going to be mapped to this self-service provider. Okay. So far, this is pretty easy. Now we skipped a step, which is we didn't configure any of our SMS providers. We didn't configure our email yet. So we need to go back and configure those. Right. So we could set this up and we can come back afterwards and do that. So it doesn't restrict you in terms of what you can set up, but for it to work, you really do need to complete those steps, right? So let's start with the mailbox first. Let's go to administration, and we can go to mailbox configurations. And here you'll see we already have one that we defined last time, and there's the details about it, right? So this is saying who is going to be sent from, any prefix. Oftentimes we have a prefix in our email so that people know that this message is coming from a system that they trust. So, you probably, for your users, you probably don't want it to say OpenIAM because they may not know who OpenIAM is, but it may have your corporate name or something about your application that would help indicate to them that this is a trusted source. Any SMTP information. And you'll see that there's a little thing down here called mailbox template. This is referring to which email system you want to use. So what we did in this version, and this is not in the community version, is that we created these predefined templates of how to connect to common SMTP providers. And if you look at the mailbox configuration templates, you'll find them all here. So you'll find, for Office, for SendGrid, for Gmail. What I recommend is that if you're using a different provider, go ahead and create a new template, right? Define what your configurations are. This way, if you have more than one mailbox that you need to set up, you don't need to keep putting, you're going to reuse this configuration across the board. The other thing, let's go back to that configuration. There's a few things here that we care about. So we have our details about where things are coming from, but there's also a notion of a failover. So when we talk about high availability, we want all of our systems to be up and running. Normally, we focus on clustering the components for OpenAM and all the things that make it up. But for systems where you have very high availability needs, like for example, we have some customers which are supporting millions of users, and at external facing, we can't have the risk of your SMTP gateway falling down. So if that's the case, then we can define a failover gateway. So if one service is down and the system fails, it will go to the next one, and eventually it will come back when the system's back up again. Right? But this gives you the flexibility of being able to always have your services up and running at all levels, not just the infrastructure level. Okay. So assuming we did the mailbox part, then the next part we need to do is we need to configure the OTP providers. So here, you'll see a bunch of predefined ones. You'll see, Twilio, SMS Global. We can add other providers if we need to. And so if we look at, if we open up the one for Twilio, what this is saying is basically, it's defining how we're going to interact. So actually, let me find another example, which, let's see if it's this one. No. So here, what we define, and so this is some fake data here. So things like your account ID, this can be your client ID in secret that is provided by your SMTP, your SMS provider. And you can define the language, you can define how, what message do you want to send, so you can customize this for your users. And you'll see that there's a placeholder here. And this is where the actual token will be sent. The length of the token, this can be 6 or 8 digits. You can define that down here as well. So you can go ahead and edit it, and you can, say it's 8. And store in secret will just basically mask it out so that people can't see it if you're typing it in. Okay. So setting up these details, and these details will largely come from whichever SMS service you're using. So you can just fill these in. It's pretty easy to do. The number that you want to start from, this is actually your internal number here. This is going to be the phone number which the message is being sent from. Okay. And this is the language. So in concept, you could have multiple configurations here which are localized, and you could be sending out your messages. So these two parts kind of set the foundation for what should happen in terms of being able to support the work that we did earlier. Okay. So with what we talked about so far, you have enough in place to be able to turn on, you can enable a stronger level of authentication for people accessing the OpenAM applications. Okay. But let's say we want to go a little bit further. Let's say we want to have a little bit more flexibility. And in that case, we can start to define an authentication rule. So let's start with something really simple. And so let's create a new rule. Let's just call this a test. So we're gonna modify this a bit. So we'll start with something really simple, and let's start with something which you would probably never ever do because there's no need for this. Let's say that you want to do a password-based authentication. So I go down here. Also, you'll see that Kerberos is supported. One more thing which I left out earlier. And let's say, so I do password-based authentication. So I add the authentication type. And then I add the authorization check. So basically, this just means that if I should use password-based authentication, and it will, once you submit it, it's going to go through the authorization check, right? This is our normal flow. So no big deal so far. We can create that, right? So now let's say we want to add SMS to this. So let's get rid of this. So let's say after successfully validating the password, we also want to do SMS two-factor. So, and now we add, again, our authorization, check. So this rule basically says after I put in my password, I'm going to have SMS, based on authentication. Those SMS options that we turned on the authentication provider, those will be the parameters that are used, and then it will do the final authorization, the check, right? So again, it's more of a two-step process. So far, these things we can already do today without needing to build out rules for it. Let's do something a little bit more involved. So let's get rid of that step. Let's say we want to support this and we want to support TOTP. We'll give people the option to do either one of these. So on the UI, you will see that they can pick from either one of these. And then I can, the authorization check must be always be the last step because it needs to be added in. Okay, and this rule now becomes, I'm going to do my password, and then the user can either pick either one of these two, which means that, it gives us the flexibility that if they don't have maybe their phone with them, for the TOTP, then maybe they can use email or some other, mechanism. But these are the two valid options that we're allowing. Okay. Again, so far, again, it's getting a little bit more complex, but we have, some choices here, right? So now let's make this a little bit, harder, or something that requires actually a flow. Let's delete these. And now let's, at this point, let's say, let's use a more of a, let's see if this is a new device, right? Which means there's no cookie, no nothing set on this device. So now I want to say that if this is true, then at this point I want to, require authentication from my mobile device from the push notification. And then I'm going to do the authorization accept. Okay, but if this is not a true, if this is not a new device, and then I don't need to force this, right? So now, for the first time, I'm kind of seeing a little bit more of a need for these flows where I can do some more complex checking and authentication, and we can also have other steps in here, like if it's not just a new device, there could also be, is it a new IP address in your new location, and we can do some checks in that way. Alternatively, we could have also, added a new role in here. You could have said if this person, let's just do that. Let's delete these. So now here in a member of roles, I can, in the bottom of my screen, I can define, some parameters like, is it the equals, is it in? So if it's in, I can define a list of roles that I'm in. Let's say it was equal to, let's just say super, right? Which means now I'm in the admin role. At this point, then I want to say, well, I want to, if this is true, then I want to force authentication with our mobile device. I'm going to do authorization accept. And if this is false, that means that I can do that, right? So now I've defined my rules, and they can, as you can see, there's a little bit of flexibility in terms of how we can shape these rules. And let's say we save this. So the next point is where do we associate these? So at this point, I can go to my content provider. And if I want to say, if I want to make this rule, if I want to make this global, meaning that everything that this content provider does, then I can add this rule over here. So I can add the webinar auth rule to this and save this. Now, you notice that the system allows you to have multiple rules. If you have multiple rules, that means any one of these conditions can be true, and the system will let you in. So in that respect, if it's hard to model, or we have very different types of criteria, we can have different rules which are linked to the same domain. And as long as any one of them is good enough, the system will let you in. Again, and so there's flexibility there. You just need to be careful that the rules you're defining kind of comply with your organization's requirements. Okay, so once this is defined, you're done. It's meaning I hit this URL for this content provider, that these rules will kick in and you will be asked to authenticate in this way. Alternatively, you don't need to make it so global. Let's say, yes, I want to delete this. Let's say in this case, I just want to apply this to the web console. So you see that there's a content, there's a pattern, a URL pattern over here. I can open this up. And at this point, I can go to authentication rule. And I can say, save this. So what this means is that I can, in effect, create a step-up authentication scenario. So let's say like I logged into the self-service portal and I just use my user ID password because we're keeping it light because we want it for, easy for end users. But admin console is admin and we want a stronger level of authentication. So if I hit the URL for that, the system's going to say, well, you haven't achieved the level of authentication that you needed to, and the system will therefore stop you and force you to provide the extra level of authentication before you can go in, right? So you have a step-up authentication happening at that point. However, if you'd already, log in to another area with the higher level of authentication, then you won't, you'll just be passed through because your conditions already apply. Okay. And pretty much that's it. That's all that there really is to kind of configuring authentication. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Like I said, that we will break this kind of video up into 2 parts and re-record it so that it has some very specific details. Like we will cover like how to do directory-based authentication and certificate-based auth, as well as some more detailed examples about the adaptive auth. So we'll break it up into 2 parts and start publishing them, later this week. Okay. I know there have been a lot of questions on this topic over the last month or so, which is the reason why we kind of want to go into a bit more detail, and it's hard to do those exact details on a live webinar. Okay, if there's any questions, happy to answer them. If not, we can close the call.